Hollow Art and Web3 Stronger Together presents At the Edges of Quantum Biology with Dr. Keryn Johnson. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. My name is Mariam Brian, founder of Hollow Art. And today we'd like to thank Laurent and Alicia for hosting the session and live streaming as we explore the edges of quantum science with Dr. Keryn Johnson, an eccentric quantum biologist with crazy, bold, new ideas, sharing a personal story about how difficult it is to be taken seriously in the scientific community when not working from a status quo paradigm. Dr. Johnson has a PhD in biochemistry, master's in molecular genetics, and a Bachelor of Science double major in plant and microbial science and chemistry.
Microbiological science.
Yes, I was reading off a text and I was thinking this is not right. So I appreciate that, Dr. Johnson. And I wonder, Keryn, if you might be able to share a little bit about yourself as we begin.
Yeah, thank you, Mariam. I guess I've got a bit of an eclectic background, having, spent a decade of my life working in that kind of field of biological sciences, or at least learning at university. And then I kind of took a bit of a break, took a year off, and I taught hip hop dancing, did VJing at dance parties, got involved in kind of teaching choreography for the South Island Cultural Fashion Awards. So I've got this kind of creative side to me, which really kind of, it needed to kind of be aired and kind of, exposed to the world a little bit. But I kind of pushed that back in the box and did my PhD after my master's. And I also, 6 months working on a construction site. So, when you kind of have different facets to your life, you kind of have to learn, I guess, how to enable those aspects. So in my PhD, I was looking at these enzymes isolated from the pancreas of sheep and how they compared to enzymes isolated from pig pancreas, and developing purification methods as an enzymologist in order to do kind of industrial production of different foods using these enzymes. And so I was making what's known as a chromatography resin to purify the enzymes, affinity chromatography. So it's like, well, I needed a little bit of kind of chemistry knowledge. I needed a bit of kind of visualization to be able to understand what an enzyme looked like in order for it to, design and develop affinity chromatography resins to purify one enzyme from another. So my kind of VJing skill set came in handy when I've spent 18 years as a research scientist in kind of regenerative medicine for the New Zealand government at a Crown Research Institute, developing products like a gap junction modulating peptide from the eye lens of sheep and cows, the sheep stomach extracellular matrix scaffold for Aroa Biosurgery. Other things that I did, things like purifying enzymes from different organisms to make an RNA sequencing kit back in 2001, a long time ago, before the new technologies of sequencing have kind of come to the foray. So I've kind of had to work in lots of different areas as a scientist, really depending on what different companies wanted me to do. And one of the most remarkable and difficult products that I've kind of had to deal with over that period of time was probably a product probably widely known, Manuka honey, and trying to understand the biological anti-inflammatory properties of Manuka honey in relation to, its composition, but also in terms of its, I guess, its functional attributes based on processes that are going on within it, as kind of you add water to honey and you dissolve it, and all of a sudden this enzyme glucose oxidase is active, and so it's not about just the static composition, it's about this kind of change of properties as things happen to it that result in different outcomes. So I guess my science has been one of exploration, one of discovery, doing things in ways which typically don't follow what other people have done. And the reason for that is when you're developing industrial processes for companies, they want novelty so they can get intellectual property. And thinking outside the box and doing things from a kind of a different perspective is often going to lead you down a different path to produce a novel outcome. And so, when you start doing things in different ways, then you get different outcomes. Wasn't it Einstein that said if you keep doing the same thing the same way and expect a different outcome, that's the definition of lunacy? So I'm considered a crazy quantum biologist, and I do things differently and I don't expect the same outcome. So I think that's sanity.
And, I wonder if we can just pause a little bit here, because what I'm fascinated in, and I was just looking to bring up some of your publications, because you're quite, you're quite a prolific, I would say, researcher, and having worked with over 50 companies, 100 publications, there's a gravitas in terms of the level of scientific research that you bring. And so what I'm interested in is, how did you decide to leave the organizations that you were working for and working with to pursue this idea? And what has been some of the challenges as you explore literally at the edges of quantum biology? Because, as you said, it's really at the cusp of breakthroughs and frontiers. So there's a sense of, is he crazy? Is he a genius? What's the line in between? And then there's that internal process. There's the external process,
Yeah.
and there's the syncing of those two realities. And what I'm wondering is, what was that journey like for you? What are the challenges that you experience now? And I'm finishing off this question, so you can enter at any point that you like.
Yeah.
What I'm curious about is, how do we advance science so that we don't have to wait 50 years for new science to become accepted in current paradigms? So I'll let you run with that, if that's okay.
Yeah. Look, that's a complete and crazy question from the perspective of, well, I was a scientist who was in a domain of materialism, a reductionist thinking. What pushed me from that into this kind of weird and wonderful world of quantum biology was an experience of profound proportions that took me, I guess, at least a decade of my life to kind of reintegrate just that experience into some kind of biological context. Okay, so because I was I was essentially the only biologist in a organization full of engineers and chemists. I was asked to do lots of things, right? So I was very busy, and being busy, you can only do so many things at once, right? And so I learned how to do things when I wasn't there. And I know that sounds like a really kind of crazy thing to say, Well, you've got automation, right? And automation allows you to do things when you're not there. So, chromatography, you can automate things. But the kind of automation I was kind of talking or meaning wasn't about a physical automation. It was like, how do we understand the universe's automation in terms of the way that it produces the outcomes that it does? And so because I wasn't there and I wasn't interacting with the environment, I wasn't having, that paradox of the observer effect. So in a way, lots of things would be happening when I wasn't there that I didn't understand. And so I kind of learned how to start to understand things, what things were happening when I wasn't there, when I wasn't interacting, and how things come back to the point of equilibrium, and then what equilibrium means in terms of, the kind of science that I was doing, in that kind of biological context. So when you start to figure out things and you kind of test hypotheses in terms of the universe, in terms of how can I, we have an idea of, well, an enzyme has a charge on its surface, and you can use ion exchange. One's positive charge, the other one's negative charge. They come together, they bind. That's easy, and that's standard chromatography. But then to figure out a process where you're using resins of opposite charge in terms of positron electron pairing to give an overall charge of 0, and you're using the idea of the isoelectric point of an enzyme where you have two enzymes come together as a pair, and one of them's positively charged or slightly negatively charged, and together they become 0. Then you start, in a way, looking at the 0 state of systems as the equilibrium point, and figuring out that, that has a higher potential to resolve complex systems into individual components for purification purposes. So the approach that I started taking when I was a scientist at Callaghan Innovation was looking at things that weren't there in order to understand how to create what I wanted via an environment selection pressure. So it was like an evolutionary biological understanding of the physics happening within the structural environment, and then kind of creating, in my mind at least for a start, to even conceptualize those kind of things, or that kind of visualization. So I was doing things that didn't make sense to people because I was using paradox. I was using both negative and positive to conceptualize a 0 state, and then understand the isoelectric point of a protein, enzyme, or whatever as that 0 state, which is only, each individual protein has that. And because it's neither positively charged or negatively charged, it wouldn't bind to either resin, and therefore I could just get it to come straight through and get what I want without actually having to do anything. And conceptually that changes the game in terms of having to use salt in order to remove a protein off an ion exchanger. And if you think, well, if you don't have to do that, then you don't have to do all the downstream processing of ultrafiltration. And so the cost of production is decreased. And so things like that are just like, well, that's a step away from the current paradigm, the current thinking, and really an enabling conceptual framework in which to see things from that 0 state as the kind of point of equilibrium, and the point that the universe really wants to go toward. And you don't have to be there in order to make it do that. It actually naturally heads in that direction. And so I guess I was doing stuff in an environment where things have been done traditionally in a particular way. And because of kind of my creativity, I started utilizing my VJing skill set at dance parties, and started utilizing those kind of techniques for looking at honey under a microscope in real time and filming it, in order to understand the kind of physics and the chemistry that was operating at nanosecond speeds. So when you're kind of working in a way that nobody else does, then you start making new discoveries. And, this is like, completely out of the blue kind of finding that there's this photophentin chemistry process happening in Manuka honey that generates hydroxy radicals. And you look at all the scientific literature saying that hydroxy radicals are bad and that they destroy all biological molecules. And then you go, well, if Manuka honey is good and hydroxy radicals are bad, how can I reconcile between the paradox? So sometimes you got to go and do bad things in order to have a good outcome, which is completely weird as well, right? So I was doing things and saying things to my colleagues that they couldn't understand. And I didn't have a scientific rationale in order to provide a way for them to understand at the time, because I was breaking boundaries, saying that the hydroxy radical is used in apoptosis, pre-programmed cell death, and that's what's removing the old cells from our body, the senescent cells. So a senolytic system that's operating in Manuka honey, which, these kind of discoveries kind of change the game. They go, well, is it not about MGO? Which is what the entire New Zealand Manuka honey system, industry, $350 million industry is kind of putting out in the market. And I'm going, well, the science doesn't stack up, that they're saying. And here are the reasons why. So all of a sudden you're coming up against, huge industries saying that we've got it wrong. Here are the reasons why. And sometimes that message isn't really well received. It gets to be like you're speaking to somebody that can't understand your language. So it's falling on deaf ears. And so,
wonder
yeah.
if I can just interject here, Keryn, to ask, could we maybe start level set the dialogue with just a very simple question of what is quantum biology? I mean, I think that will help, as we're talking about speaking a different language, and I'm thinking of our demographic and audience, how can we conceptualize the emerging and evolving field of quantum biology?
Yeah, well, I guess my take on quantum biology might be different from somebody else's, and might be different from the idea of the use of the Schrödinger equation in terms of the many states a biological system can be in, versus the single state observed. So in a sense, the emergent field of quantum biology is to try to explain the weird and wonderful, right? The things that materialism cannot explain, things like consciousness, things like emotional experience, the choices or free will, what's time, what are the fundamental aspects of our innate ability to conceptualize stuff and then convey that to somebody else in a way so that they can understand as well. So for me, quantum biology isn't a taking quantum physics, which is, put forward as a really, really cool way to look at atoms, and then apply that really cool way of looking at atoms in terms of human biology. I guess my branch of quantum biology that I'm creating isn't using quantum mechanics at all. It uses a different kind of philosophical perspective of, you could say, the idea of supersymmetry inversion, or you could say baryonic symmetry. So in a way, I relate the geometry of the human body and the processes that are operating within us in terms of mirrored symmetry and the balance of, philosophically, you could say kind of yin yang, positron, electron, but I've also integrated kind of neutron with positron and electron with proton. So in some respects, it's a little bit it's a bit of a mashup in terms of its east meets west, and it utilizes the conceptual frameworks of quantum mechanics. So the idea that there's a superposition or a wave function, and then that collapses based on measurement. So it kind of has that built into it, but it also utilizes Planck scale, which is like, your mum's pixelated kind of thing, down at the Planck length. And because of the inversion process that I use, I kind of turn it upside down, right? So I make the very, very small, the very, very big by inverting it. And that allowed me to really kind of conceptualize the framework of what the universe looks like before the beginning, in order to then try to identify those features of that early universe that result in the functional 26 cosmological constants that we have. So it's a little bit like I'm going to turn the universe inside out, and in doing so, reconcile my own kind of perspective and align that with my human anatomy in terms of my retina pointing inward, being inverted, looking into the mind rather than external. So from that, as a kind of paradoxical framework, develop a conceptual understanding of how the mind's generating the light that I am observing, and the features of my own biology that's responsible for that. So, where do you start, right? Where do you start and
there's
turning the
so
universe
many
inside out?
Absolutely. So if you allow me, I'd like to probe a little bit more here in terms of supersymmetry, and looking at time dilation, quantum tunneling, the idea of um, asymmetry as we look at the expansion of our universe, and how you might reconcile that within this conceptual framework that you've put together. Because I see correlations between the Vitruvian, golden ratio idea of mathematical coherence in, the macro, meso, micro. How do you reconcile the symmetrical with the asymmetrical?
Yeah. So I guess if you start with what we know at the moment in terms of cosmological composition, and obviously there's lots of different ideas floating around out there, which ones are worthwhile to explore. I guess I started with a framework of baryonic asymmetry, right? So yeah, you have to start with what's known already and what people are presented, and kind of look at that and go, okay, we have this kind of cosmological composition of dark energy 68%, dark matter 27%, and matter 5%, and matter is the atoms, and those atoms have, in them they have the protons and the neutrons and the electrons, and that's biology, right? Biology is kind of held at that level of understanding, which doesn't give you the kind of functionality of quarks within a proton and a neutron. So, I started with the basics. I figured out that, well, for me, baryonic asymmetry is a real I guess, a difficult one to reconcile when positron electron pairing is coming into the universe. And so you go, well, here we have a symmetry of separation of positive and negative, and together they become zero. So you can kind of understand, well, that zero is nothing. And yet we have something from nothing, and that kind of breaks the first law of thermodynamics. So when you start going, well, if that breaks the first law of thermodynamics, how can something be made from nothing? And so there are kind of conceptual problems that you have to come up against when you're trying to come up with a new idea. So you kind of park that to the side and you go, well, okay, how do we shift the perspective that everything's there at the beginning, but you can't see it? So that's like, well, we can't see everything if it's all one thing, because there's no contrast between that and anything else, and we can only see contrast. So and that is a kind of conceptual framework to begin with. Is there a form of energy where, if you bring things down to a cold enough temperature, maybe we can form a Bose-Einstein condensate where many atoms become one atom? So that kind of became a conceptual framework for me for the beginning of the universe as a cold form of energy. And weirdly, we have this idea of the hot Big Bang. And the hot Big Bang nucleogenesis and the concepts that as atoms cooled, they formed, the quarks came and bound together, and then they cooled further and that bound the electron. It didn't wash with me, sorry, but Big Bang is like a black box that nobody really knows what's going on inside, and I'm too eager to see inside the darkness in order to understand the light. So I went, well, I will stick with my idea of a Bose-Einstein condensate. So I look at that in terms of Einstein, and the E equals mc squared, the energy mass equivalence. But, light's faster than energy, maybe not. I rearranged it, right? I'm not very good at mathematics, right? I use empirical approaches, and then I look at those empirical approaches, and they tell me things. They tell me things in relation to, well, if energy is equivalent to mass, as Einstein has kind of put forward, and I rearrange that to make it c squared equals E divided by m, and we know that 1 over c squared is related to epsilon naught mu naught, which is kind of the vacuum permittivity and permeability, then there are attributes of that rearrangement that have a geometrical effect on energy. And I know that's a little bit weird, but I went, well, maybe the baryonic asymmetry that we now see has got nothing to do with cosmology. Maybe it's actually got to do with quantum tunneling and entanglement. So the ideas of baryonic asymmetry I parked them, I put them aside, and I said, well, I'm going to start with a symmetry state, and I'm going to start with a Hebeck, a helium Bose-Einstein condensate, because if you go and look at the periodic table, when you take things down to near absolute zero, the only atom of the periodic table that's fluidic is helium. All the rest are solid. So I made the universe incredibly cool in terms of a conceptual framework, and that generated a helium Bose-Einstein condensate with a radius of c. And the reason why I did that, because c squared equals E divided by m, and for me, E divided by m became rise over run on a mathematical geometry of a cross. So E, negative E, M, negative M. And I could then kind of conceptualize a framework for the process of quantum tunneling and entanglement as that rearrangement to E equals mc squared, and how magnetism could contain light, and really kind of see it in terms of a physicality of the universe at the beginning of time as a conceptual framework. And so when people have made Bose-Einstein condensates, I think the first one was in 1995, or it might have been earlier than that. And they've made helium Bose-Einstein condensates, and they know the functional properties of that and the distance between the electrons. And that distance is 4e to the negative 14 meters. And so, being curious, I plugged in that and I converted it into a number, and I guess in a kilojoules per mole. Why I chose kJ per mole, well, I'm Keryn Johnson, and you go, well, that's a very crazy thing to do, and yeah, it is, but kilojoules is actually a biological system, right? It's a way of understanding energy in biology. So that and the terminology EV, electron volts, makes no sense to me at all. Nanometers, I'm not a physicist, so I used kJ per mole, and I looked at that, and that gave me a number that was bigger than the speed of light. And I thought, that's really interesting. What if we got alpha particles emitted from this helium Bose-Einstein condensate at that kJ per mole speed as a meters per second, as an inflationary process of faster than light expansion of the universe?
So if I can just jump into, I think it's fascinating, and I think beyond my level of intelligence. And, what I'm interested in is the philosophical, experiential, social impact of stumbling, onto something that is, I presume from what I picked up, uh, akin to some ancient wisdom and some ancient knowledge, and reintroducing that at a time where we are, experiencing some paradigmatic shifts, both in science, technology, and on a lot of different planes. And I wonder what that experience is like for you in terms of, I can only imagine, elation, excitement, and then potential frustration, a sense of why don't other people get it? So
yeah, look, an emotional roller coaster, really, really. What I guess cracked the nut open for me, so to speak, was the revision of quark charge calculations for protons and neutrons in order for that boson, that condensate. Okay, so the human aspect of me was elated beyond elation, right? I had a divine spiritual experience from that discovery, and it was like the last piece that had to fit into the puzzle, that everything got revealed. It was like, oh, now what? So you kind of get to that point of revelation, and it's like you're left there naked in terms of, I can't use the knowledge that I had. So it's like, what do you do? I'll just take a minute. An incredibly emotional experience. An incredibly empowering experience. From the perspective of no longer having the ability to reconcile the experience with biological knowledge. And how do you convey that to somebody?
Thank you.
And
That's
you
powerful.
You have no way of sharing.
And I wonder, as the feelings come and they evolve and they transform, and time, we've spoken in the past about, acausality, atemporality. When there's this shift, and I'm thinking here, as we map civilizations over the course of human history, and there's millennia of, we can think of Galileo and so many others, who Copernicus. There's a lot of different ways that people, you know navigate the complexity of accessing something that may be potentially beyond the current level of understanding or time. And so I wonder if you have any words of wisdom to share with us about how we might be able to, help accelerate the scientific landscape from a funding perspective. And I'm here thinking about peer-reviewed journals, having worked
Yeah.
in higher education for 14 years. There's a certain um, there's a certain impetus to work on research fields that are funded, that are popular, and
Yeah.
there's a research timeline in terms of that funding that is somewhat myopic and driven by various agendas. And so when we explore the potential for humanity to, really sit and walk and exist, and I don't have the verb for it, but just be at the edges of science, what would be some potential ways that we might be able to cultivate the next generation of scientists and creatives to be able to perhaps learn from and you know support the community in a way that makes it easier for the next person who comes along with discoveries such as yours?
Yeah. I would say, for a start, get a financial advisor. Take out income protection. You need a backup plan for when you have the epiphany, right? Because in a way, the epiphany is a point where you only have such a small window to experience it, that is paradigm shifting. And because it's paradigm shifting, everybody thinks you're crazy. So you kind of have to walk the path of crazy in order to work, in which to then bring back and share. So you need, nobody's going to fund you. Nobody's going to fund you being crazy. So in a way, I was fortunate enough to be able to fund myself to be crazy. In terms of, well, I've got income protection. I can walk away and resign from the science job that I had, because how do I reconcile, right, the challenge? So it is incredibly difficult, and it's a hard decision.
Thank you. And I'm thinking here of science industries and technology firms and companies who might want to experiment with, a bit of curious labs and ways of bridging the. We spoke about VJing. I just want to tie in the arts into the science as we move from STEM to STREAM. We're really seeing this exploratory innovation happen through this unification of art and science as a way of explaining phenomenon that we don't have language or conceptual frameworks for, that help us to engage in the mysteries that we all experience.
Yeah, look, I think letting creativity loose is the way forward in order to break the boundaries, right? You kind of have to go, all of a sudden, I'm not going to, make up a solution at this concentration. I'm just going to let that creative process happen. And it's like, well, it's unscientific. Yeah, that's the whole point. It really has to be. It will lead you in a way which is different from what you've done previously. And so the outcomes that you see are different. And then you do something different again, and the outcome's different again. And so you have a landscape of different outcomes, and then you have to reconcile how each one is different in terms of the functional input. And then that kind of goes, well, if I'm starting in a different position and the universe is then moving it into this direction, giving me an outcome, then I need to understand the beginning position in terms of the outcome when I'm not there. So that kind of got to that framework of what's non-interactive logic. What's the process and where the universe is giving you the outcome you want, but you're not understanding initially the beginning point. So you have to understand that environment in the beginning point and the selection pressure in the field that creates the outcome. So yeah, that can only be experienced through creativity. It's not something that really, that's not something that really comes from a disciplined science approach.
Sure. And here I'm thinking of, the process of peer review, the way that we've established clinical trials and studies for statistical significance, and the prevalence of, falsified scientific findings, especially as we learned recently in terms of neuroscience neuroscientific studies, the percentage of papers that were potentially not based on scientific rigor. And so we're really looking at the philosophy of science and the pragmatism of, I'm thinking of Charles Sanders Peirce and the role of logical fallacies, cognitive bias, and educational methodologies or doctrines, we might want to say. How can we open the door for these paradigmatic shifts in institutions now so that we can set the stage for potential breakthroughs over the next 5 to 10 years? And I ask this because I know change is slow. There's a whole, there's a whole industry behind
there's a
education.
behemoth. That's a behemoth.
Absolutely. Textbooks and, curriculum development, assessments, and really it's a franchise of dissertations that need to be defended for many, many years to ensure continuous income. And so it's very challenging for a doctoral, graduate to say, hey, my entire dissertation is based on potentially faulty science. And so we don't see that. And I wonder if the role of collective humility might factor in and how we might be able to make it acceptable for scientists to increasingly say, you know what, I think this was, let's go down a different path. And I ask this as art and science seem to have parallel timelines where throughout the course of art history, we've seen, avant-garde and breakthroughs in the concepts of that art history provides, mirroring or at least prefacing scientific revolution. So with, abstract expressionism, cubism, there's so many different ways that we've been able to shift the way that we perceive reality through art, opening the door for science to, back it up with some experimentation.
Yeah, well, with the VJing that I was doing, obviously I was, projecting light. And I would film a screen that was playing the image that I was filming. And so I was creating, I guess, weird and wonderful artistic imagery for people at dance parties in order to, enjoy the music, enjoy the visuals. But I started learning more about how light operated in terms of the artistic side of things rather than my scientific, not realizing that in my science of biology in atoms, there's actually light in the electromagnetic field. And so conceptually, I hadn't put those two together. I hadn't conceptualized that the Barmer electron transitions, bit of science, and hydrogen biology corresponded to spectral information. And so art and science can be unified in terms of really letting go of dogmatic viewpoints. And dogmatism has been taken apart by science in terms of religion, right? And here I'm going, well, yeah, I will look at combining religion and science as a paradigm shifting perspective as well. And that's, that puts many cats in the box in terms of Schrodinger. And so when you open it at the right time to actually see the decay happen. So there's not two outcomes, there's three. There's the alive cat, there's the dead cat, and there's the moment of life and death passing at that point where the decay is happening, but you've opened the box at that right moment in order to see. That's the epiphany, right? Is to witness the process that's actually happening within the mind that's responsible for giving vision through the veil of visible light. And, that is, in a sense, earth-shattering, because it breaks the illusion. And it breaks the idea that the world that we're seeing is visible through photons coming from an external source, and provides a context for the unstable atoms operating in our neurotransmitters to produce light coming from an internal source. So when you kind of smash that paradigm and nobody else can kind of reconcile because they haven't had an experience like that, then you are only able to kind of share it with people who understand, who have had similar experiences. And so you try to find a community that you can speak to. And I guess because of the I won't say hijacking of science by commercial interests. Obviously, I've worked in a commercial setting for 18 years, and I made lots of discoveries, and the need for development of new IP for companies made me creative. But yeah, there's a dogmatic, rigid, materialistic viewpoint that science is held in terms of atomic structure with protons, neutrons, and electrons. And here I'm saying, well, that original Bose-Einstein condensate has positrons as well, and they're all just at the same energy level. So where the positrons gone? Well, that's part of the problem in terms of the baryonic asymmetry and the quantum tunneling and entanglement. So we need to shift our rigid thinking in order to see things from different perspectives. If we've said something's set in stone, well, what is a stone? It underlying that kind of atomistic perspective, there's four forces: gravity, and strong and weak, and electromagnetic, and underlying the integration of gravity and quantum mechanics is, well, no, that hasn't actually happened yet. They haven't done that. So the debate still kind of rages in terms of how to integrate gravity at the quantum scale. Well, my supersymmetry inversion model's done that due to an implosive process rather than an explosive process. And when you look at things using a different lens, a different way of looking at the universe, then it offers up a different solution. And it's really that needs to be further explored in a public domain openly, without putting boundaries or limitations on what it is. So it's like how to share something that is completely paradigm shifting, but build a bridge between the two paradigms so that one can walk back and forward. And that's a difficult task, and it's a task that takes some time. Yeah.
And it happens, I think, in pockets throughout the world in ways that, we can transcend cultures and language. And I think art is a fantastic portal into some of these things that, you spoke about the four forces. There's a fifth one that people are speaking about. There's all sorts of, you know, woohoo science. And I say woohoo science because, if we look back at the course of human history, there's always been, people at the outer edges of a system, of an established system. And these people later then become, part of the established system, and then the process continues like a fractal. Julia Mandelbrot said. I mean,
Yep.
I think what we might be able to deduce from that is that we are in a pattern of continual evolution. I'd like to shift the last few minutes of our conversation toward a little bit of a lighter. It's been delightful to chat with you, Keryn, as always.
Yep.
A little bit of a lighter dialogue around, when you were VJing at these parties, what was the sensation as you played the music? What were some of the types of music that you most enjoyed playing, and how do you see the relevance in your scientific work?
So I was, I guess, doing mainly visuals, but I do play a little bit of, I guess you'd say it's kind of a combo hip hop trance type, house music, so quite kind of clubby dance music. But I started doing chemistry under a microscope and projecting that as well. And because of the cymatic properties of the sound creating structure, there were effects of, I guess, the sound and the chemistry that was operating, which were quite harmonious in their kind of properties. So, obviously cymatics is a big thing in terms of sound healing technologies and things like that. The inability to understand something at a particular part and I guess the evolutionary processes that are going on in science and art is merely a lack of information from my perspective. Do we know how to time travel? Well, you would say no, and yet we're traveling through time. Our electrons, I like to say, we're all the same age, and our electrons are 13.8 billion years old, and yet what's their half-life? Well, it's something like 10 to the 29 or something. So if you look at the kind of dancing aspect of and music, I think it's important to have an outlet for creativity, and often, I guess, in a very rigid scientific framework, there's not too much outlet for that. I think I was very privileged to be able to be creative in that setting. If you think about how people to read scientific literature, and the repeatability of literature is only about 30% or something, then the difficulty comes is, well, if people have had to publish or perish, and they've got that kind of difficulty in keeping their own personal security in terms of their livelihood, it's hard for people to then it's being and so follow a process, the scientific process, and that process is very much grounded in rational thinking, grounded in the idea of following on somebody's footsteps and doing incremental discovery. And so we don't get earth-shattering, paradigm-shifting science coming along very often because of what the structures are in scientific organizations.
Sure.
They don't let people run around being crazy, doing weird and wonderful stuff because they don't see a functional outcome in blue sky research, which is kind of leading to they don't know where, they don't understand what you're doing. You can't even convey to them the physics of negative time dilation in terms of faster than light, because Einstein rules in terms of light being the fastest thing in the universe. Well, if it was, then we wouldn't have the expansion process, where the things furthest away from us are getting further away from us faster. So I think people need to kind of down tools and kind of just have conversations for a while rather than trying to do more and more of the same, because I see that it's not working, and it's not working really well.
I appreciate that. And I think, this ties in nicely to the work that we're doing here at Hollow Art and the series of global dialogues where we bring in different perspectives from people pioneering in the areas of art, science, technology. I think there's an opportunity for us to hold space and really listen to what's happening and what is, and to suspend judgment, to look at what we might be able to see if we are, I see somebody put in the comments, to slow down, to speed up. It's an apt way of describing it. And when we look at quantum gravity and the expansion of the universe and these young universes or galaxies that we see at the edges, we launched with a talk with NASA about the James Webb Telescope and the
Right.
beautiful, stunning visuals that really speak to these archetypes in our being. And there's a spiritual element of just awe and amazement. And I think art is able to access that sublime tonality through some things that perhaps our modern day science can't explain. And I wonder if we might be able to close with some thoughts about perhaps the ineffable and the poetics of science. Over to you.
Thanks. I would say that there's beauty hidden in emptiness, and it allows one to create a landscape that is revealed internally, and it's up to you to then provide the gift in order to make it manifest into the external for others to see as well. So we've been given a gift, and choose to use it wisely.
Thank you so much for joining us, Keryn. Both hands. I think really what we're doing, this would be apt. I think, as we move from stems to stream, and stream being science, technology, reading, engineering, art, and mathematics, we're seeing a return to a post-Renaissance way of engaging with ourselves, with each other, and our environment. And I very much appreciate your time with us today. Any final words as we close our session?
Yeah, look, consider turning the universe inside out and looking inward rather than outward. From that perspective, then the inner work you do manifests on the external physical. And we can really understand science from a different perspective. And that allows us to do things in different ways, which inherently seem to be more beneficial than the approaches that we've been taking so far. So things become a lot easier when you look for that zero state point and align what you're trying to achieve fundamentally through that scientific methodology to that state through a process I would say is non-interactive logic. And if you don't know how to get to a point of non-interactive logic, come see me. I'll help.
Thank you so much for joining us, Keryn. And as we finish our session today, I'd like to invite our viewers to visit our website, Holo, H-O-L-O, as in the holographic principle, hyphen art, art.io. We can share some of the visuals that we create and some of the work that you have in terms of explaining science through a comic strip, some of the work that you're doing. And thank you to Web3, Laurent, Alicia, and the rest of the team for making today happen. Very much appreciate your brilliant opening and sharing of heartfelt experiences. Thank you for joining us, Keryn.
Thank you, Mariam. That's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.